Well, welcome everybody. My name is Mafe. I'm part of the support and content team here at Flourish, and today I'm going to be delivering our fortnightly webinar on slope charts. So let me just get all my settings. There we go. So for today's session, as I said, my colleagues Luis and Simona are on chat duty. So if you have any questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat. I'll do my best to address them. But if I miss any, I'm sure they will get them. And in today's sessions, we're going to be taking a look at the basis of slopes. What are they good for, and when and how to use them? I'll cover some essentials, so data formatting you'll need to create your own slopes in Flourish and basic settings. And then we'll go over a practical example where I'll build a slope from start to finish, and just a brief recap at the very end. So let's just start with it. Brilliant. So first things first is that slopes are charts that are used to represent variations in data over time. They're made up of axes and lines, which represents the different series. So here we can see in the anatomy of a slope, basically that we have a dual axis in this case. We have in this case 2010 and 2015, and we have points that are positions on both axes and joined by a line. And here what we are conveying is a comparison of the values in 2010 and 2015. So besides the points and the lines, slopes also convey information through the direction of the slopes of the lines and the steepness. So when we see a line going upwards, we are seeing an ascending trend, so values increased. And when we're seeing a steeper line, so a more acute angle, that means that the variation is bigger. For instance, in the series D, we can see that the value decreased very dramatically from 2010 to 2015. Whereas if we compare it to the series B, we see that the variation is quite minimal. And so the line is almost flat. So that's the way in which slopes convey meaning and just show data. But now, what are slopes good for? So there we go. Some good cases for slope charts are to show, to compare data over a specific period of time, preferably 2 years. It is true that you can create slopes with more than 2 years. Particularly, Flourish doesn't have a limit of columns you can bind to the chart, but it is recommended that the series are kept to a minimum just because this way they're more readable and more effective. Slopes are also good to show or spot trends. We can see which values ascended, which descended, and we can also compare rankings and so on. And we can compare data over short periods of time. So this is it. Now, I'm going to address the elephant in the room, which is that slope charts and line charts are quite similar. So how can we learn when to use which chart? So first, let's start by saying that slope charts and line charts are sister charts, which means that they are virtually used for very similar things. Both are used to represent time series, although slopes are used to represent short periods of time, specifically 2 years, whereas lines are great for longer periods of time or even months or days. They both have time on the x-axis and values on the y-axis, and every line is a separate series. However, some differences are that slopes, as I said, work better with fewer lines and with a shorter period of time, so just a couple of years, for instance. That slopes can also show ranks and percentages where lines can't automatically, at least, and that slopes don't need a zero baseline. And this is very important. So just to bring this point across, here we can see 2 charts, one's made with our line bar pi template in Flourish and the other using the slope, and they both have the same data. And this is just to show you that in theory, you are able to arrive to very similar results with both chart types. However, we can see that there are some things that lines are way better at. For instance, here in our pop-ups, we can see that every single one of the pop-ups goes for a single year, whereas in the slope, because the point is to compare values, we can see that the pop-ups are compound, so we get all values for each of the years that are bound. And this is definitely not very user-friendly nor very effective. So this is one drawback from using slopes as a line chart. We can also see that the x-axis is quite small in order for it to be readable, whereas in our line bar pi, it is much more readable and suitable for this type of longer time series. You can also see here that y-axis is clear, whereas in the slope, you don't actually get the numbers, you only get the values of each of the series, and so on and so forth. And the contrary is also true. You can use our line bar pie to create a slope chart, which is what I did just here. I only bound values for 2 years, and I get effectively a very similar chart. But again, slope is really good with the pop-ups, for instance, in this case of adding complementary information that explains, for instance, why are the increases happening. You get values on both sides of the axis, so you can see the starting value and the ending value. Because the values are positioned relative to each other, meaning they don't start at a zero baseline, we can see a very nice separation between them, and it's simply easier to locate versus this, the line chart where we start in a zero baseline and then we increase by 2000s. Here we also have the axis title on the axis, whereas here we can add it as a note or as part of the text in the chart. So comparisons are honestly endless, but this was just to kind of like bring across the idea that even though these are very similar chart types, they're definitely not the same and they have different use cases. So moving on. Now I'm just going to cover the essentials that you need to create your own slope with Flourish. And the first is the data format. So slopes require wide format data. And that is, you need categories in one column. So in this case, entity, and your annual records or your time records are going to be each split into a single column. So in this case, we could see 2010, 2015, and all the values. And that is what's going to be bound to the results column binding. And then you can see here, you can add a value for line thickness. You can add a filter, category, and extra info for pop-ups. Moreover, slopes in Flourish can show 3 different metrics. First, we have the scores, which are the raw values. So in our example, for instance, we can see here from 80 to 10 or from 60 to 100. Then we also have the rank, which would be the relative position. So what the template will do here is it will gather all the series and it will position them along a ranking. It will give you the first, the second, the third, and so on positions on both sides of the axis, and you can see the change. So for instance, we can see the D started being number 1 in the rank in 2010 and ended up being 4th in 2015. And then we would have the percentage change. So in this case, charts are going to be represented in this way. This is very good to show, for instance, quick trends. So to see which values decrease and which values increase and how big that change was. So here we can see that the angle is quite steep on series C because the change was quite dramatic, whereas the same is true for series D, but in the opposite. So it decreased and we can get a negative value right here. Okay, so that's actually all the theory that I'm going to go over today. And now we can jump right into our practical example. So we're going to be working with our world in data about oil production per country. And this is roughly where we're going to encounter. It's data per country, and then we have records for all the years in terms of production. And I think this is, yes, terawatt per hours for oil production. So this is what our data looks like when we download it from our world in data. We have, again, the country, a code, the year, and the oil production. And as I just mentioned, this is not going to be suitable for our slope because slopes require the years to be separated into columns. So just to show you what I did here, and this is after a little bit of wrangling, this is going to be available for you in the end, so don't worry. I basically pivoted my data by using a pivot table here in Google Sheets, and I kept my entities to be in one single column, but then I split all the years, so each one of them is a separate column. And this is effectively what's going to be each of the points or each of the axes rather of my slope chart. So when I go into Flourish, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select which years I want to compare. I can choose, for instance, 1900, 1913, and these are going to be my 2 axes or 3 and so on. So, and I also added extra information. I got the code, the ISO code for each of the countries, the region, so I can split them easily and maybe create a filter or bind by color and whether the country is a member of the OPEC or not. So I'm just going to go into Flourish and create a new visualization. I'm going to my template chooser and I'm going to select one of my 2 starting points for the slope chart. So we have the default or the inline labels. However, you are able to put the inline labels inline within the editor itself. So it doesn't really matter which one you choose in this case. And here, as we always suggest, we take a look at the data and we can see that this is exactly what I described earlier, which is that I first have a column for my country, then I have columns for the years, then an income group column that is acting as a category. So I'm coloring by this one. And I also get the change and the change on the continent, which I could have potentially bound as well. And if I take a look at the preview, we can see how this is looking. And we can see that I have highlights, but I'll go over all of these in just a second. So I'm going to clear my sheet and I'm going to grab all of my data and paste it here. Okay, so I'm just going to do the bindings as accordingly. And I'm going to be comparing 1980. There we go, CG. To 2019. For my filter, I'm going to be adding whether these countries are members of the OPEC or not, so column D. And my category is going to be my region, so column C. And here, I get this very interesting view because I still have my highlights here from the blueprint that we have on the template chooser. So I'm just going to get rid of this, and that should show me everything that I wanted. Perfect. I'm just quickly going to change my theme. There we go. So what are some of the things that we can do to improve this chart or to keep working with this chart? First, I'm going to show you that the filter is working. So let's check. Not OPEC countries. That is all correct. And is a member of the OPEC. Lovely. I'll go back to all. So here in chart, you can do a couple of things. You can change the circle radius, and this is the size of the circles right here. So I can increase them, or I can, by the country, decrease them and even make them disappear. However, it is useful to keep their circles because they kind of like they are like a visual anchor for your users. So they're able to position the series more easily. So I'll just leave them to be 0.3. And the slope width, this is the thickness of the line by default. So it can be very thin or it can, by country, be quite thicker. I'm just going to let them be a 2. And the lines can be either curved, straight, or step. So let me bind another value just to show that more clearly, perhaps. And let's add the year 2000. There we go. So if we go for the straight, we're only going to get straight angles. If I go for a curve, it's going to be a more curved line. And if I do steps, I will get this view. But I'll just go back into straight. And for the highlights, so highlights here are just going to, well, predominantly highlight the values that I indicate. So for instance, if I want to show only Canada, it is only going to show me the values for Canada by default. However, if I hover on the other series, I do get their information and I do get their pop-ups. So it's not like you lose the information. It's just that you get a preview of just one country or as many as you select here. I'll take that away. And now we go to visualize. So this is what I meant about the metrics you can show using the slope. If I see scores, I'm only going to get, in this case, the total production per country, and I'm going to get them order, in this case, ascendingly, meaning that the larger the value, the higher up is going to be in the axis. If I do descending, I'm going to get quite the opposite. And you need to be very careful with this because it can be confusing for your audience. But one case in which you may want to use descending is with the ranks. So with the ranks, we all know that 1 is higher than 48 in this case, because we're saying that it's in the first place rather than the 48th. So you would want to use the descending, and that is going to order them so. Here we have with the ranks the ties mode, which means if you do get the circumstance where 2 values are exactly the same, how do you want to represent them? And I'm just going to keep the default in this case. And then we have the percent change, which is simply going on from the starting point in 1980, what was the difference in 2019? In this case, it doesn't matter that I have a mid step right here because it only is going to calculate the change relative to 1980 and 2019. But I'm going to go back to scores and I'm going to go back to ascending because that is what I'm trying to convey. Now, the hide mode in the slope chart, I think, is particularly interesting because given that we have so many lines and we're trying to show steepness and different, acuteness of the angles, working with the aspect ratio can be quite useful because it can, stretch my chart and allow me to see my series better. So here on the little question mark bubble, we can see that we can leave it to be 1 if we want it to be square, and smaller values means bigger height. So if I go, for instance, to a 0.5, it's going to be quite a tall chart, but I'm just going to leave it perhaps to 0.7 or even less. Even less still. There we go. I think I'll just leave it to 1 then. Lovely. And then we move to colors. Colors in this case is very similar to anything you've seen previously. For instance, on line bar pi, you get your palettes here and you can do color override. So for instance, if I wanted to color a specific country, specific shade, I would simply go and say United States are going to be the shade of red. And maybe this is not working for some reason. Let me just double check that and maybe try with a different country. Not exactly sure why that is not working, but well, the point being is that usually color overrides do work, and as soon as you input the name of the series, so in this case the countries and the color code, it will override the ones that you have applied as a category. Then for the labels,
you're coloring by region, so you would override with the region name or set your category to be the country. Sorry.
No, you're fine. Thank you. Then let's double check that. And if I go here, nope, there seems to be some sort of issue there, but
if you bind your country name column to the categories,
that may be it.
But now you get a different color for each country, but it should use the right overrides now.
Yes, that is working, and thank you. And now we've all learned that if you have a category bound to a different column, probably custom overrides won't work, which is quite interesting, but thank you so much, Luisa. So I'll just go back to my regions, and there we go. And then if I move to labels, this is what I explained earlier, that we have two starting points. One is with the labels to the side, as in this case, and one is with the labels inline, which is like this. They are just on the very beginning of the line. And here we can see that it's not always a good idea because they can, just be a bit of a mess. So I'm just going to let them to be on the side. Then I can change whether I want my labels to be on both sides of the slope, whether I want them just on the left or just on the right. And this is completely up to you and really depends on your data and what you're trying to show. And here we just have other settings for the label. So for instance, my width, if I decrease this to be, for instance, 5, I'm going to lose a bunch of labels that are definitely larger than just 5. So I'm going to bring that back to be 10, for instance. Distance would be the separation with the dot. So if I increase this, they're going to be more separated. And if I decrease it, they're going to be closer together. And same with the text. In this case, they are being colored by the name of the series, but you can create fixed colors for all of the labels. Now we have other settings here for the lines. So if I turn them to be off, I believe these are for inline. Oh, these are not working. Oh, sorry. So these settings appear to not be working particularly. I'm not exactly sure what's going on here. So let's just keep moving on and I'll just leave them to be on the side. So for the pop-ups, as I mentioned earlier, automatically they're going to be including all the information that you have on your data. So if I bind multiple series or multiple years, I'm going to see a very long pop-up with all that information. In this case, I only have 3 years bound and whether they're a member of the OPEC and the region. And that's what I'm seeing my pop-up, but I can make them, I can customize them and add different information. If you only have, for instance, 2 years and you want to explain why are the, like what's the cost behind the increases and the decreases, you could definitely add that through a custom pop-up via custom content. And then for the axes, that's going to be all the settings that are going to be affecting this bit right here. So my font size, whether they're smaller or larger. So if I make them 0.9, they're going to be smaller. And vice versa, if I make them 1.9, they're going to be much bigger. The font color, the axis color, whether I want these to be, for instance, darker, I may want to be black. And if I put this into 0, they're going to be straight lines instead of being dashes. And I can also change the position of the labels to be on top or at the bottom or hidden. However, hidden might be a bit complicated for your users to understand what you're trying to convey. So I would recommend keeping them on either at the top or at the bottom. And now for the controls, anything having to do with the filter. In this case, as I mentioned, I have my filter bound to be either, whether these are part of the OPEC. So I could have them as a drop down or as buttons and just styling them accordingly. Like them to be normal, advanced, and I'm just going to increase the width a little bit. And now I can see a different views of my chart. And I'm going to quickly change the aspect ratio. There we go. So I can have a full view. As for the legend, in this case, I have it enabled. We can see here my regions. I can position it below or above, or I can disable it. In this case, I think it's quite useful to have it because it obviously conveys information, knowing that the different colors of my countries are the colors of my different regions. I'm going to leave it above. And you can style it as you want in the center, on the other side, and change in the text weight, and the title weight. And you can change also the title, etc. Very similar to all of our other templates that have this module. And similar with the number formatting, all of these settings are common to other templates. So now that we're taking a look at the data, this is the importance of the slope chart. So if I compare it to a line chart, I'm obviously not getting all the nuances. I'm definitely not seeing, for instance, all the granularity of the data between 1980 and 2019, but I am getting simply the general trends, right? So I'm seeing here that clearly from year 2000 until 2019, there have been some huge increases, for instance, in the production of oil from the United States, or I'm seeing that Saudi Arabia is also increasing. If I go to only the countries that are members of the OPEC, I can see which countries are decreasing in their productivity. So for instance, here it's Iran. Or here's Venezuela. And the point of this chart type is just to convey the bigger, more general trends. So definitely not the granularity that, for instance, a line chart could give you, but just the bigger ideas or the bigger concepts. So whenever you're thinking of using a slope chart, it's always a good idea to ask yourself whether your data can actually stand this more simplified view and whether it still can be an accurate representation of what you're trying to convey. So going back to my presentation, I'm just going to go and do a quick recap of what I've shown you today, which is what slopes are good for. They're good for comparing or showing change over short periods of time. They're also great for ranking your information. So position them as I show you with the ranks and seeing the relative position amongst the series. To build a slope chart, you need to have your data in white format. You need to have your years into separate columns or any other type of metric that you're going to be splitting your slope in. And slopes can have filters, they can have categories and varying line thicknesses. I actually did not show you this, so let me go back very quickly. And I'm going to bind, for instance, same value as 2019 right here for my line thickness. If I take a look at this, we can see how that changed. So now we get thicker lines for larger productions and thinner lines for smaller productions. So in this case, for instance, you can definitely add data that maybe it's not oil production directly, but you can relate this data to other values. So for instance, you can view GDP or CO2 emissions. You can complement your data that you're showing with the positioning and the steepness of the line, and also add another level of visual encoding, which would be the thickness of each of your series. And here are some of the resources that we have on our slope template. So we have an overview help deck and also how you can highlight parties in your slope. And again, I actually forgot to show you that. So let me just go back very quickly. And if I go to my chart and highlight slopes, here's where you can, oh, sorry, I did show you that. Apologies for that confusion, but I can just show that again. And it's, you can highlight different parties so they show. And for instance, let's do Kuwait. And here it is. That would be the view of my highlighted parties if this is what I'm trying to convey to my users in the first strike of sight that they get from the chart. And that is about it. That would be our little overview of the template. If you have any questions, now that we have some minutes, I can definitely take a look at the chat if you have any outstanding questions. And just don't forget to sign up for the next webinar, which is going to be on our very exciting announcement about our acquisition by Canva. We're going to be covering empowering the world to design with data. So we'll take a look at how the acquisition is going to allow our users to gain this big integration from Flourish and Canva and how you can benefit from it, moving charts from one place to another, embedding them into Canva presentations, etc. That'll be on the 1st of March. So please register if you're interested. And if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to take a look at the chat now. Where did the info from the pop-ups come from? So do you mean in which particular point? You mean in this view, Ian? Okay, lovely. So in this case, the information is coming directly from the columns that I bound. So here I can see that I get my entity name, which is the country. I know that my 3 axes are 1980, 2000, and 2018. So I get these 3 values there. And I also have the filter, which is whether a country is a member of the OPEC or not. And I get that in the pop-up. And in this case, I also get the 2019 value and the region. So if I were to, for instance, have a separate, I can have an extra column with more data or even with text, and then I can bind that and use that on the, using the custom content of the pop-ups. Yes, so you don't need to, in this case, exactly bind info for pop-ups. That will work if you're using the custom content, but by default, it will basically include the information that you're binding by default on the template. Can you show ranks and percentage change on the same slope chart? Absolutely. So if I go here to chart, and let me just get rid of the thickness because I think it's a bit distracting in this case. And also of my highlights. So here in ranks, and perhaps it's going to be quicker if I actually show 2000 and 2019. So here we go. So by default, I'm going to get the ranks order from least to like lowest to highest, because obviously the chart is understanding that 48 is worth more than first, but we know that in ranks it's actually the opposite. So I'm just going to switch to descending, and now I get a much better view. So we can see that, for instance, now between 2000 and 2018, United States moved positions from being the 2nd largest producer to the largest producer, whereas in this case, Russia moved from being the 3rd to being the 2nd, and Saudi Arabia went from being the 1st to being the 3rd. So that will be with the rankings. And then with the percentage change, we can see general trends. So we see which countries are increasing, sorry, because these are descending, so I'm going for ascending. There we go. We can see which countries are increasing their production and which countries are decreasing their production in relative to the year 2000 and 2019. If I change these value, for instance, if I go and change this to be 2016, this is definitely going to change because it's going to be, again, relative to that specific year. So now I can see which countries have had a bigger increase in a shorter period of time. And similarly, if I change for the scores, for instance, I'm going to get a very different view from what I got when I visualized 1980 to 2000 to 2019. So that is really the important thing you need to remember with slopes is that they are just a snippet in time. They're not the full picture, and it's very important to use them correctly. Do you have any more questions? Okay, if not, then thank you very much for joining me today in this webinar. I hope to see you all on our webinar on the 1st of March. And yes, hope you have a lovely day and thank you so much.